For 3 years as her executive secretary, Ryan Cole had never once asked to leave early. Not for illness, not for emergency, not even for a half-day off. But that Thursday afternoon, he glanced at his watch and said it plainly. "I need to leave early. I have a date." The room went silent. Claire Whitman, the CEO known for her ice-cold composure, froze mid-sentence. Since when did the man beside her every single day have a life she knew nothing about? When Ryan stood to leave, Claire reached out and caught his wrist. The question escaped before she could stop it. Ryan had been sitting at the desk outside Claire's office since 8:30 that morning, the same way he did every weekday. His workspace was clean and efficient. A single monitor angled just right, a leather notebook open beside his keyboard, and a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Dad," tucked near the edge. He answered emails, rerouted calls, confirmed meetings, and managed the chaos that came with running a company worth several $100 million. Claire depended on him for that. She had since the day he was hired 3 years ago. She remembered that interview clearly. Ryan had walked in wearing a charcoal suit that fit him well, but wasn't flashy. His resume was solid, his references impeccable, and his demeanor calm in a way that felt genuine rather than rehearsed. What stood out most was the way he answered her hardest question. She had asked him what he would do if she gave him 2 impossible tasks at the same time. He had smiled slightly and said he would ask which one mattered more to her, then handle that one first and figure out the second immediately after. No panic, no excuses, just logic and honesty. That was Ryan. He never overpromised. He never dramatized. He simply did the work, and he did it better than anyone else she had ever hired. Over the years, Claire had come to rely on him, not just professionally, but in ways she didn't fully admit to herself. He knew how she took her coffee. He knew when she needed to be left alone, and when she needed someone to push back on a bad idea. He knew the exact tone to use when a board member was being difficult, and he never once made her feel like she owed him anything for it. But Claire also knew almost nothing about his life outside the office. She knew he had a son because he kept a photo on his desk, a small boy with a wide grin holding a baseball glove. She knew Ryan left at exactly 5:30 every day, no exceptions. And she had always assumed it was because of the boy. She had never asked for details. It felt intrusive, and besides, she liked to keep things professional. That was the boundary she had drawn for herself, even as she found herself noticing the way Ryan's voice softened when he talked on the phone during lunch breaks, or the way his eyes lit up when he mentioned his son in passing. Claire had convinced herself that admiration was all it was. Respect, appreciation for competence. She was a CTO after all. She had built her career on discipline and control, on keeping emotions separate from decisions. Feelings were distractions, and distractions led to mistakes. She had learned that lesson early, back when she was still climbing the corporate ladder and watching colleagues fall apart over office romances and misplaced trust. She had sworn she would never be that person. But lately, something had shifted. It started small, a flicker of irritation when Ryan mentioned he had plans over the weekend, a strange emptiness on the rare occasions he called in sick, a tightness in her chest when she imagined him sitting across from someone else at dinner, laughing the way he sometimes did when they worked late, and the office felt less like a battlefield and more like a refuge. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it would pass. It didn't. That Thursday had been a long day. Claire had spent most of it in back-to-back meetings, navigating a merger negotiation that was turning messier by the hour. Ryan had been there through all of it, taking notes, managing the logistics, making sure she had everything she needed before she even realized she needed it. By late afternoon, she was exhausted, but relieved. The deal was finally moving forward. She had leaned back in her chair and glanced at Ryan, who was scrolling through his tablet with the same focused expression he always wore. "Thank God that's over," Claire said, allowing herself a rare moment of candor. Ryan looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made the room feel a little warmer. "You handled it perfectly," he said. His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something else underneath it. Pride, maybe. Or certainty. Claire felt a strange flutter in her chest and looked away quickly, pretending to check her phone. That was when Ryan glanced at his watch. It was 4:15. He closed his tablet and stood, gathering his jacket from the back of his chair. Claire looked up, confused. Ryan never left early. He never left before her, and she rarely left before 6. "I need to leave early," Ryan said, his voice steady and calm. Claire blinked, waiting for the explanation. A doctor's appointment, a family emergency, something that made sense. But Ryan just looked at her with that same composed expression and added, "I have a date." The words hung in the air like something physical. Claire felt her entire body go still. A date. Ryan had a date. The man who sat outside her office every single day, who knew her schedule better than she did, who had never once mentioned anyone in his life beyond his son, had a date. With someone. Someone who wasn't her. "A date," Claire repeated, her voice sounding strange even to herself. Ryan nodded, slipping his arms into his jacket. "Yes, I'm sorry for the short notice. I cleared your schedule for the rest of the day, and I forwarded any urgent calls to my cell. You shouldn't need anything before tomorrow." He said it so casually, as if this were a normal request, as if he hadn't just upended something Claire didn't even realize existed until that moment. She wanted to say something. She wanted to ask who it was, where they were going, how long this had been planned. But the question stuck in her throat, tangled up with a feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something sharper, something that felt uncomfortably close to panic. Ryan picked up his bag and slung it over his shoulder. He looked at Claire one more time, his expression unreadable, and then he turned toward the door. That was when something inside Claire snapped. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just moved. Her hand shot out and caught his wrist, her fingers closing around the fabric of his sleeve. Ryan stopped. He looked down at her hand, then back at her face. Claire could feel her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't know what she was doing. She only knew she couldn't let him walk out that door without saying something, anything, that might make this feeling stop. "Why didn't you date me?" The question came out raw and unfiltered, nothing like the composed tone she used in boardrooms or negotiations. It was desperate. It was vulnerable. It was everything Claire had spent her entire career avoiding. Ryan stared at her, his eyes widening slightly. For the first time in 3 years, Claire saw him completely caught off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then looked at her with something that might have been shock or maybe disbelief. "Claire," he said softly, and the sound of her name in his voice sent a jolt through her chest. She realized she was still holding his wrist. She let go quickly, her hand falling back to her side, but she didn't look away. "I mean it," she said, and her voice was steadier now, even though her hands were shaking. "I've liked you for a long time, Ryan. I just never said anything because I thought you weren't interested, or maybe because I was too proud to risk it. But if you're going out with someone else, I need to know. I need to know if I missed my chance." The silence that followed felt endless. Claire could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic outside, the faint buzz of her computer. Ryan was still standing there, his bag halfway off his shoulder, his expression unreadable. She had no idea what he was thinking. She had no idea if she had just made the biggest mistake of her professional life. Then, slowly, Ryan's lips curved into a small, almost sad smile. He set his bag down on the desk and turned to face her fully. His eyes were kind, but there was something else there too. Something cautious. "Claire," he said again, and this time his tone was gentler. "You didn't miss anything. and this isn't what you think it is." Claire frowned, her mind racing to make sense of his words. "Then what is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing something carefully in his mind. Then he let out a slow breath and reached for his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then held it up so she could see. It was a text message. The contact name at the top read Ethan. Claire's eyes scanned the message. "Dad, are you still coming at 5? I picked the restaurant. You're going to love it." There was a photo attached, a little boy with messy brown hair and a grin that looked exactly like Ryan's, holding up a hand-drawn menu. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. She looked up at Ryan, her confusion written all over her face. He smiled again, softer this time, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "My date," Ryan said quietly, "is with my son. It's his birthday dinner. He's been planning it for 2 weeks." Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. She felt like the floor had just shifted beneath her. Relief, embarrassment, and something else she couldn't quite name all crashed into her at once. "I didn't know," she managed to say, her voice thin. Ryan nodded, his expression understanding but still guarded. "You never asked," he said simply, and there was no accusation in his tone, just a statement of fact. Claire felt her cheeks flush. He was right. She had never asked. She had spent 3 years working beside him, relying on him, maybe even falling for him, and she had never once asked about the most important part of his life. Ryan picked up his bag again, but this time he didn't turn to leave. Instead, he looked at her with something that might have been hope, or maybe curiosity. "Do you want to come with me?" he asked. The question was so unexpected that Claire almost laughed, but Ryan's face was serious, his eyes searching hers. "To your son's birthday dinner?" she asked, incredulous. Ryan nodded. "He's 7. He likes dinosaurs, mac and cheese, and asking a million questions about everything. And he's been asking me for months if I have anyone special in my life." Ryan's voice softened. "I think he'd like to meet you, if you want to, that is." Claire stood there, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. This was insane. She had just confessed feelings to her assistant, nearly ruined everything, and now he was inviting her to meet his son. But as she looked at Ryan, at the way he was watching her with that quiet patience she had come to depend on, she realized something. She didn't want to let this moment slip away. Not again. "Okay," she said, and the word came out steadier than she expected. Ryan's smile widened, and for the first time that day, Claire felt like she could breathe again. "Let's go," he said, and he held the door open for her. Claire grabbed her coat and followed him out, her heart still racing but her mind strangely calm. She had no idea what was about to happen, but for once, she was willing to find out. The elevator ride down to the lobby was silent. Claire stood beside Ryan, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, trying to process what had just happened. She had confessed her feelings to her executive secretary. She had grabbed his wrist like some character in a melodrama. And now she was on her way to meet his 7-year-old son at a birthday dinner she had not been invited to until 5 minutes ago. The absurdity of it should have made her laugh, but instead, she felt something closer to dread settling in her stomach. Ryan seemed calm, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the descending floor numbers. Claire glanced at him from the corner of her eye, searching for some clue about what he was thinking. His expression gave nothing away. That was one of the things she had always admired about him, his ability to stay composed no matter what was happening around him. But right now, it made her nervous. She had no idea if he was uncomfortable, annoyed, or simply unbothered by her sudden confession. When they stepped out into the parking garage, Ryan led her toward a modest sedan parked near the far wall. It was clean but well used, the kind of car that suggested practicality over status. Claire had never thought about what Ryan drove. She realized with a pang of guilt that she had never thought about a lot of things when it came to him. She had spent 3 years working alongside him, depending on him, and she had barely scratched the surface of who he actually was. Ryan unlocked the car and opened the passenger door for her. Claire hesitated for just a second before sliding into the seat. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and something sweet, maybe the remnants of a snack his son had eaten on the way to school. There was a booster seat in the back, a stuffed dinosaur wedged into the cup holder, and a stack of coloring books on the floor. It was such a stark contrast to Claire's own sleek, spotless vehicle that she felt a strange tightness in her chest. Ryan got into the driver's seat and started the engine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire stared out the window as they pulled out of the garage and onto the street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. She could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on her, and she hated it. She had built her career on clarity and control, on knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. But right now, she had no idea where to begin. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice cutting through the silence. Ryan glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "For what?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "For putting you in an awkward position. For assuming things I had no right to assume. For making this weird." She spoke quickly, as if getting the words out faster would somehow make them hurt less. Ryan was quiet for a moment, his hand steady on the wheel. "You didn't make anything weird," he said eventually. His voice was calm, almost reassuring. "You were honest. That's not something to apologize for." Claire looked at him, startled by the gentleness in his tone. She had expected discomfort, maybe even irritation, but Ryan just seemed thoughtful, as if he were turning her words over in his mind and considering them carefully. "I still shouldn't have said it like that," Claire insisted. "You have every right to have a personal life. I had no business acting like I had some claim on you just because we work together." Ryan's lips quirked into a faint smile, though he kept his eyes on the road. "Claire," he said, and there was something almost amused in the way he said her name. "You're allowed to have feelings. You're allowed to say them out loud. I'm not upset." Claire frowned, unsure whether to believe him. "You're not?" she asked. Ryan shook his head. "No. Surprised, maybe. But not upset." He glanced at her again, and this time his expression was softer. "Honestly, I thought you saw me as just another employee, someone useful but replaceable. I never imagined you felt anything beyond professional respect." Claire felt a sharp pang of regret at his words. She had been so careful to maintain her distance, so determined to keep things professional, that she had never stopped to consider how it might look from his perspective. "You're not replaceable," she said quietly. Ryan's smile widened just a fraction, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned onto a side street lined with small shops and restaurants, the kind of neighborhood that felt warm and lived in. Claire watched the scenery pass by, trying to imagine Ryan here, walking down these streets with his son, living a life that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or board meetings. They pulled into a parking spot in front of a family-style Italian restaurant with red checkered curtains in the windows and a hand-painted sign that read, "Marcello's." It looked cozy and unpretentious, the kind of place where kids could be loud and no one would mind. Ryan turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, his hand still resting on the wheel. "Before we go in," he said, his voice more serious now, "I need you to understand something." Claire turned to face him fully, her heart beginning to race again. "Okay," she said. Ryan looked at her, his expression open, but guarded. "Ethan is the most important person in my life. Everything I do, every decision I make, it's for him." and I'm careful about who I bring into his world because I don't want him to get attached to someone who isn't going to stick around." Claire felt the weight of his words settle over her. She nodded slowly, understanding what he was really saying. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a little boy who had already lost one parent and deserved stability. "I understand," Claire said, and she meant it. Ryan studied her for a moment longer, as if trying to gauge whether she truly did. Then he nodded and opened his door. "Come on," he said. "Let's not keep him waiting." They walked into the restaurant together, and Claire was immediately hit by the smell of garlic and fresh bread. The place was bustling with families, the sound of laughter and clinking silverware filling the air. Ryan scanned the room and then smiled, his entire face lighting up in a way Claire had never seen before. He lifted his hand in a wave, and Claire followed his gaze to a corner booth where a small boy was bouncing in his seat. Ethan was exactly as she had imagined him from the photo on Ryan's desk: messy brown hair, bright eyes, and a grin that took up half his face. He was wearing a t-shirt with a cartoon T-Rex on it, and he waved back at his father with so much enthusiasm that he nearly knocked over a glass of water. Ryan walked over quickly, and Claire followed a few steps behind, suddenly feeling very out of place. "Dad!" Ethan shouted, loud enough that a few nearby tables turned to look. Ryan laughed and ruffled his son's hair. "Hey, buddy, happy birthday." Ethan beamed, and then his eyes landed on Claire. His expression shifted from excitement to curiosity, and he tilted his head slightly. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice bright and unfiltered. Ryan glanced back at Claire, and for the first time since they left the office, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by that steady calm she had come to rely on. "This is Claire," Ryan said, gesturing for her to come closer. "She works with me. I invited her to join us for dinner. Is that okay?" Ethan looked Claire up and down, his gaze assessing in the way only children could be. Then he shrugged and grinned again. "Sure. Do you like dinosaurs?" he asked. Claire blinked, caught off guard by the question. She glanced at Ryan, who was trying not to smile, and then looked back at Ethan. "I think they're pretty cool," she said, and to her surprise, she meant it. Ethan's grin widened. "Good. Because I know everything about them. Did you know that the Tyrannosaurus Rex could bite with a force of 12,800 pounds? That's like getting squished by 3 cars at once." Claire raised her eyebrows, genuinely impressed. "I did not know that," she said. Ethan nodded proudly and launched into another fact about velociraptors. Ryan slid into the booth across from his son, and Claire hesitated for just a moment before sitting down beside him. The vinyl seat was cracked in places, and the table was slightly sticky, but none of that seemed to matter. Ethan was talking a mile a minute, his hands moving animatedly as he explained the difference between herbivores and carnivores. Ryan listened with the kind of patience that came from years of practice, nodding and asking questions at all the right moments. Claire watched them together, and something inside her shifted. She had spent so long thinking of Ryan as her assistant, as someone who existed to make her life easier, that she had never fully considered what his life looked like outside of her orbit. But here he was, completely at ease, laughing at his son's jokes and reminding him to drink his water. It was a version of Ryan she had never seen before, and it made her chest ache in a way she didn't quite understand. A waitress came by to take their orders. Ethan immediately asked for spaghetti and meatballs with extra cheese, and Ryan ordered the same. Claire glanced at the menu and chose something simple, not wanting to draw attention to herself. When the waitress left, Ethan turned his attention back to Claire. "So are you my dad's boss?" he asked. Claire hesitated, unsure how to answer. Technically, yes, she was Ryan's boss, but the word felt wrong somehow, too clinical for what their relationship had become. I guess you could say that, Claire said carefully. Ethan frowned. Do you make him work really late? He asked, and there was a hint of accusation in his voice. Claire felt a pang of guilt. She thought about all the nights Ryan had stayed late to help her prepare for meetings, all the times he had rearranged his schedule to accommodate hers. Sometimes, she admitted, but your dad is really good at what he does. I rely on him a lot. Ethan seemed to consider this, then nodded. He's the best, Ethan said matter-of-factly. He makes really good pancakes, and he always helps me with my homework, even when I don't want to do it. Ryan laughed softly, his hand reaching over to ruffle his son's hair again. Thanks, buddy, he said. Ethan grinned, and then leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he were about to share a secret. Dad, did you find me a mom? He asked, his eyes darting between Ryan and Claire. The question hit like a sledgehammer. Claire felt her face go hot, and she looked down at her hands, suddenly very interested in the napkin in her lap. Ryan, to his credit, didn't miss a beat. Ethan, he said gently, that's not really how it works. Ethan frowned, clearly confused. But you said you were going on a date. Dates are for finding someone to marry, right? Ryan sighed, and Claire could see the faintest hint of color rising in his cheeks. Not all dates are like that, bud, and this wasn't that kind of date anyway. This was a date with you, remember? Your birthday dinner. Ethan's face lit up again, the awkward moment forgotten as quickly as it had arrived. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Can I get cake after? With the candles that don't blow out? Ryan smiled, clearly relieved by the change of subject. We'll see, he said. Claire finally looked up, and her eyes met Ryan's across the table. There was something unspoken in his gaze, something that made her heart beat faster. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge the ridiculousness of the situation. But before she could, their food arrived. Ethan dove into his spaghetti with the enthusiasm only a 7-year-old could muster, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. Dinosaurs, school, baseball practice. Claire listened, occasionally chiming in when Ethan asked her a direct question, but mostly she just observed. She watched the way Ryan cut his son's meatballs into smaller pieces without being asked. She watched the way Ethan leaned into his father's side when he laughed. She watched the way they moved around each other with the kind of ease that came from years of being a team. And for the first time in a long time, Claire felt like she was seeing something real. Not a boardroom, not a negotiation, just a father and son, sharing a meal, living a life that was messy and imperfect and utterly beautiful. She didn't know if she had a place in that life. She didn't know if Ryan would ever see her as anything more than his boss. But sitting there in that crowded restaurant, watching Ethan talk with his mouth full and Ryan trying not to laugh, Claire realized something important. She wanted to find out. By the time dessert arrived, Claire had almost forgotten why she had been so nervous. Ethan had spent the last 20 minutes telling her about his favorite video game, a space adventure where you had to rescue aliens from evil robots. He explained the rules with such earnestness that Claire found herself genuinely invested in whether or not the blue alien made it off the planet. Ryan watched them both with a quiet smile, occasionally interjecting to correct a detail or remind his son to take a bite of his food. The waitress brought out a slice of chocolate cake with a single candle stuck in the center. It was one of those trick candles that kept relighting no matter how many times you blew it out. Ethan's eyes went wide with delight, and he immediately launched into an enthusiastic attempt to extinguish it. After the 5th try, he started laughing so hard he could barely catch his breath. Ryan reached over and pinched the wick between his fingers, finally putting the flame out for good. "Make a wish first, bud," Ryan said, and Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, his face scrunched up in concentration. Claire watched him, this small boy who seemed so full of life and hope, and she felt something crack open inside her chest. She had spent so many years focused on her career, on building something that mattered, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be present in a moment like this. No agenda, no strategy, just cake and laughter, and a little boy who believed wishes could come true. Ethan opened his eyes and grinned. Ryan handed him a fork, and he dug into the cake with the same enthusiasm he had shown for everything else that evening. Claire glanced at Ryan, and he was already looking at her. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not pity, not discomfort, but something softer. Something that made her think maybe she hadn't ruined everything after all. When Ethan finished his cake, he leaned back against the booth with a satisfied sigh. His face was smudged with chocolate, and his t-shirt had a new stain to add to the collection. Ryan pulled a napkin from the dispenser and wiped his son's face with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "All right, birthday boy," Ryan said. "It's getting late. We should probably head home." Ethan groaned dramatically but didn't argue. He slid out of the booth and grabbed his jacket from the seat. Then he turned to Claire, his expression suddenly serious. "Are you going to come over again?" he asked. The question caught Claire off guard. She looked at Ryan, unsure how to respond, but he just watched her with that same calm patience he always seemed to have. "I don't know," Claire said honestly. "Would you want me to?" Ethan thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, you're nice. And you didn't get mad when I talked about dinosaurs the whole time." Claire felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "I liked hearing about dinosaurs," she said, and she meant it. Ethan grinned, and then turned to his father. "Can we go to the arcade on the way home? Just for 10 minutes? Ryan shook his head, though his expression was affectionate. "Not tonight. It's a school night, remember?" Ethan sighed again, but didn't push. He grabbed Ryan's hand and started pulling him toward the door. Ryan glanced back at Claire, and she stood quickly, following them out into the cool evening air. The drive back to the office was quieter than the drive to the restaurant. Ethan had fallen asleep in the back seat, his head lolling to one side, the stuffed dinosaur clutched in his arms. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the city lights blur past the window. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if there was anything to say. But the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt almost companionable, like they were both processing the same strange, unexpected evening. When they pulled into the parking garage, Ryan turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. He glanced back at Ethan, making sure he was still asleep, and then looked at Claire. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Claire could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the distant sound of a car alarm going off somewhere above them. "Thank you for coming," Ryan said finally. His voice was soft, careful not to wake his son. Claire turned to look at him, and the words she had been holding back all evening suddenly felt too big to keep inside. "I'm sorry," she said, and Ryan frowned. "You already apologized. You don't need to do it again." Claire shook her head. "Not for earlier. For all of it. For the last 3 years. For treating you like you were just part of the furniture. For never asking about your life, your son, anything that mattered." Her voice cracked slightly, and she looked down at her hands. "You deserved better than that." Ryan was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his tone was measured. "Claire, you're not a bad person for keeping professional boundaries. That's what we both signed up for. I never expected you to be my friend. I was your assistant. That was the job." Claire looked up at him, her eyes stinging. "But you were more than that," she said. "You are more than that. And I was too scared to admit it because I thought it would make me weak. I thought it would make me vulnerable. But sitting there tonight, watching you with Ethan, I realized something." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I don't want to be the kind of person who's too proud to care about someone. I don't want to be so focused on protecting myself that I miss out on something real." Ryan studied her for a long moment, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. Then, slowly, he reached over and took her hand. His grip was warm and steady. And Claire felt something in her chest loosen. "I'm not going to lie and say I didn't notice the way you kept your distance," Ryan said. "I did. And yeah, there were times when I wondered if you even saw me as a person or just as someone who made your life easier. But I also understood why you did it. You're a CEO. You're in charge of hundreds of people. You can't afford to let everyone in." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I'm glad you let me in tonight, even if it was just a little bit." Claire felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly. She wasn't someone who cried easily, but something about the way Ryan was looking at her, with so much understanding and no judgment, made it hard to keep her composure. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "I don't know if this is something that can even work. You have Ethan, and I have the company, and I don't want to mess up either of those things." Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know either," he said. "But I think we can figure it out. If you want to, that is." Claire looked at him, at the man who had been beside her every single day for 3 years, who had just invited her into the most important part of his life without hesitation, and she felt something settle inside her, a certainty she hadn't felt in a long time. "I want to," she said. Ryan smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made the world feel a little less heavy. "Good," he said. They sat there for a moment longer, hands still linked, the silence between them comfortable and full of possibility. Then Ethan stirred in the back seat, mumbling something about velociraptors, and Ryan let go of Claire's hand to check on him. "I should get him home," Ryan said, and Claire nodded. She opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, feeling lighter than she had in years. Ryan got out as well and walked around to her side of the car. "I'll see you tomorrow," he asked, and Claire smiled. 8:30 sharp, she said. Ryan laughed softly. "Wouldn't miss it." He started to turn back toward the car, but Claire reached out and caught his arm. He looked at her, surprised, and she stood on her toes and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. It was brief, barely more than a brush of her lips against his skin, but it was enough. When she pulled back, Ryan was staring at her with an expression that was equal parts shock and something that looked a lot like hope. "Drive safe," Claire said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. Ryan nodded, still looking slightly dazed, and then he smiled again. "You too," he said, even though she wasn't driving anywhere. Claire watched as he got back into the car and started the engine. She stood there in the parking garage, her arms wrapped around herself as he drove away. The tail lights disappeared around the corner, and she was alone again. But this time, the loneliness didn't feel suffocating. It felt like the quiet before something new began. Claire walked to her own car and slid into the driver's seat. She sat there for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying the entire evening in her mind. The confession, the misunderstanding, the dinner with Ethan, the way Ryan had looked at her when he said they could figure it out. She thought about all the years she had spent building walls around herself, convinced that emotions were liabilities and vulnerability was weakness. She thought about how close she had come to letting Ryan walk out of her office without ever saying a word. But she had said something, and he had listened, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Claire started her car and pulled out of the parking garage. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets mostly empty except for the occasional taxi or late-night delivery truck. She drove slowly, taking her time, letting herself feel everything she had been pushing down for so long. The fear, the hope, the strange, terrifying excitement of not knowing what came next. When she finally pulled into her own driveway, she sat in the car for a few minutes, staring up at the dark windows of her house. It was a beautiful house, the kind she had dreamed of owning when she was younger and still climbing the corporate ladder. But it had always felt empty, like a place she lived in, but never really inhabited. Tonight, though, it felt different. Like maybe it didn't have to be so lonely after all. Claire got out of the car and walked to her front door. She unlocked it and stepped inside, flipping on the lights as she went. The house was silent, but it didn't bother her the way it usually did. She kicked off her shoes and made her way to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water and leaning against the counter. She thought about Ethan's grin when he talked about dinosaurs. She thought about Ryan's hand in hers. She thought about the way he had said they could figure it out, like it was the simplest thing in the world. And for the first time in a long time, Claire allowed herself to believe that maybe it could be. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And that was worth more than all the power and success in the world. She finished her water and set the glass in the sink. Then she walked upstairs, climbed into bed, and fell asleep with a small smile on her face. Tomorrow would come, and when it did, Ryan would be there, just like he always was. But now, everything felt different, because now, she wasn't afraid to admit that she wanted him to be.